The mustache has always been a sign of power, wealth, and social status, but the Mexican mustache has always been more. It has been a symbol of passion, loyalty, and a symbol of change. So what happened to the Mexican mustache where it became a novelty item that is sold in Halloween stores as an accessory to a poorly unfavorable representation of the Mexican culture? Thank you guys for joining back. My name is Derek, the owner of Beach Bum Beard. This is another episode of Beard History, so let's jump into it. The Mexican mustache found its peak during the Mexican Revolution, and the characters that played the huge role all had different styles of mustaches. So villain, you had President Porfirio Diaz, who had this overgrown mustache that was untamed and just kind of sporadic, but it would grow down towards and over the lips in his. He was a president who believed in democracy in the beginning, however, became one of the first dictatorships of Mexico, and he would rule for another 30 years to come, allowing the rich to profit from his policies, which is the cause of the Mexican Revolution. Then you had the replacement, and the replacement was Francisco Madero. And Francisco Madero believed in democracy and freedom of speech. President Madero, his mustache was also overgrown over the lip, but his would tie into a goatee. November 20th of 1910, Madero actually declares the revolution, and those who support his candidacy prior to that and also supported him in the revolution would start to grow the mustache with the goatee. Madero needed support when he started the revolution against President Diaz, and he would team up with what we would call the hero or possibly even the celebrity of this storyline, and that would be Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa had a mustache that was shorter but thicker and fuller, and it would reach to about the end of the lip, and it would curl in some cases. It was very well groomed, neatly cleaned, probably used quite a bit of oil and wax to maintain it. Definitely celebrity status. Pancho was very popular during the Mexican Revolution because as a bandit, he was kind of seen as the Robin Hood of the day. Pancho would actually lead men into northern Mexico on their way back to Mexico City after the assassination of President Madero. But along the way, Pancho would steal cattle and cash crops from the landowners that once supported President Diaz, and then he would sell those cattle and cash crops to the United States in exchange for money and weapons that he then used to assassinate and kill the wealthy landowners that he had stolen from. Pancho was a bandit in the early days. He would steal from trains, homes, businesses, etc. But it wasn't until he met Abraham Gonzalez and Francisco Madero when he would learn that he could turn it into a good thing by helping the people and being a bandit towards the rich. And so those supporters and even the guerrilla fighters that would support him would mimic him with the mustache and the curls that he became famous for. But then the one character that represented the people, but he wasn't as famous or as popular as Pancho Villa, and that was Emiliano Zapata. Emiliano Zapata took a stand in the revolution because he was tired of watching people from his southern states lose land to the wealthy landowners. It wasn't until Zapata had tried political channels to solve this problem and realized that President Diaz was turning a blind eye each time so that his friends who were the wealthy landowners could continue to profit and steal land from the peasants, the farmers, etc. Zapata then takes men that are volunteered fighters such as farmers, peasants, bakers from the villages, join the revolution, marching north to Mexico City. In fact, at one point after Madero's death, the revolution then continues with Zapata moving north from the south, Pancho Villa moving from the north to the south, and then a third player, Carranza, marching in. Once the three of those revolutions make it to Mexico City, then release President Puerta from power, and the three of them now control Mexico City. They sit down and they kind of talk about who they should put in charge of the three leaders there. And Zapata really makes it clear that he is only in this revolution because of land reform. Zapata would then become extremely popular during that time period. His mustache was a little bit more a mixture between President Diaz and Pancho Villa. It is well groomed. It's not overgrown such as President Diaz's, but his would go past the lips. This is where the difference is between Pancho. The mustache would go past the lip down to about where the chin is. Each of those four mustaches having a representation and a following of people based off of your beliefs and your ideology. The Hollywood of America only saw the bandit. Hollywood saw bandits that rob trains, homes, businesses, etc. And as we all know, there's two things that sell movies, and that's sex and villains. In the early silent films, the Mexican characters would be played as bandits who were robbing, murdering, stealing, lying, cheating, raping. It was so popular at this time that these movies would be deemed as greaser movies, such as Tony the Greaser in 1911, Bronco Billy and the Greaser in 1914, The Greaser's Revenge in 1914, sprung up pretty much everywhere in Hollywood at this time. These movies became so popular that the Greasers usually were played by Mexicans, but then later on would also be played by Latin characters because it became such a connection between the character and the term that the term became a synonym for violent Hispanic. The Mexican Revolution itself in 1910 doesn't help depict any better pictures. So with the documentaries being filmed in Mexico during the revolution and then been played on American movie screens, the experts believe that because of the greaser movies and because of the actual filming of the war, the two begin to kind of blend together, and people even more so associate greasers with the violence that they're seeing from these documentaries. In fact, one of the reasons why Pancho Villa becomes so popular during the revolution is because he actually signs a contract with the Mutual Film Corporation to film the battles that he is taking place. In exchange, they paid him, which he desperately needed this money because he was building an army. One of the cool things about that, in a sense, was that Pancho Villa would actually delay some of his battles so that the cameras could be set up during the daytime and film everything. He would basically delay the battle, allow the cameramen to go and set up in where he believed the battle was going to be, and then he would then attack Federal Army. As he would attack, they would then film it, make a movie or a documentary, and then send it back. I found that interesting because how awkward would that have been as not only just Pancho Villa, who is now having to make plans to attack at different points during the day to allow this, movie film crew to record it, but as a regular soldier, how do you not ride in on your horse and start shooting and killing, not look at the cameras at that point and just be kind of like, you know what I mean? That has to be kind of awkward. And did the enemy see it? Did the Federal Army see those cameras as they're marching into the battle where they're obviously being killed at? That's just something I found interesting and I wanted to add. And so these documentaries start to blend in. In fact, the New York Times then writes an article about the barbaries of Mexico. So then the New York Times would then state the movie tended to focus or linger on the burning of the bodies and not so much on the political stance behind the actual battles. So with the revolution, there was a lot of political back and forth and then new political parties wanting to try to change things up, but none of that was being captured. They're just focusing on the blood and gore and not so much the actual reason behind the war. So it wasn't until roughly about 1922 then Mexico actually begins to stand up and stand out against these movies, threatening to ban all Hollywood productions and movies that that depicted Mexicans as bandits or criminals, but Hollywood did not get rid of the greaser movies, but instead they changed up the nationality of each of those characters. So instead of having a greaser that was from Mexico, they would then make fictitious names or fictional places that would help disguise the name. Examples, if you look at The Dove 1928, the greaser is from Costa Rojo, which didn't seem to bother anyone during that time, but then they did remake the movie in 1932, and it was called The Girl of Rio, placed in a area of a border city of Mexico, and the directors and the screenwriters had forgotten to change the details of that information, which then sparked Mexico to speak out once again, threatening to create an embargo against all film production companies and all movies that they produce if they continue to make movies that depicted Mexicans in an offensive way. So in 1940, the threat of Germany invading other countries kind of worried Hollywood. Now, they didn't have a change of heart, but they did realize they needed to change, and so they had to find a new way to sell movies in case the European market was closed off. President Roosevelt at the time was trying to implement a policy called the Good Neighbor Policy, which was to help create a connection between Mexico and Central America at the time with America and with trade in case something like this happened. American movie producers also found that if they started focusing on locals and heroes and national historical figures, that they could also sell those movies to Americans as well as South America and Mexico. So they would then create movies for the American viewers so they could technically, spend the weekend in Havana, spend the night in Rio, or travel down to Argentina Way, all three of which were filmed in 1940 and 1941. Juarez became one of the first Mexican heroes to ever hit American movie screens. This was a huge change because at the time, because of movies like that, the Hispanics were no longer being viewed as bandits or ignorant peasants, but more of a well-educated individual. Movies like this would continue to go on, and they would find heroes to play the main role, but as post-war movies began to flood the market, those stereotypes that had kind of drifted away would quickly return later. In 1971, there was a press conference from the American president, and the dreadful words that hit the media that night and then would blow up into a massive media coverage.
War on drugs is a war that we have to win, and a war that we can win.
It was a political campaign to discourage the consumption, distribution, or manufacturing of narcotics at the time. One of the most recognizable statements of that press conference was,
"Public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse."
In the early 70s, cocaine had become a major problem in American streets.
Public enemy number one, motherfucker!
The war on drugs is a history lesson of its own, which deserves its own dedication, which is why we won't go into further details onto that. However, the basics are that we, as a country, declared war on a substance, and that never changed anything over the years, except the expense of roughly $51 billion per year, or a total of $1 trillion by the end of the campaign. Now, the war on drugs had multiple characters that played major roles in the failure of the campaign itself. However, look at the negativity that a few people were able to develop, and an entire country then had to absorb the blunt end of that. For instance, look at how we perceive Colombia still today because of the actions of one man such as Pablo Escobar and his reputation. The drug cartel would use trade routes between Mexico and America to transport or distribute drugs from Mexico to America. Now, these trade routes had been in place long before the cartel had gotten a hold of them. In fact, the bandits would use them way back in the day. One example was even during the prohibition of alcohol, bandits would transport alcohol through these routes to American gangsters who would then resell them underground. Now, the difference is the cartels were using these same trade routes they had been using for years to transport and distribute cocaine into America. But now there was a war declared. The bandits were now cartels and gang members. Hollywood ate this up because there was nothing like bringing back the old greaser movies. Hispanics were no longer the main roles in these movies, nor the main character, but secondhand vicious villains. Movies such as Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia in 1974 and Duck You Sucker in 1972 depicted the Hispanics as uneducated peasants or bandits again. Even when Hollywood would make a movie capturing the viewpoint of a Latin American, such as Walt Proud or Boulevard Nights in 1979, both movies consisted of stereotypes or main characters who were bound to become gang members and a part of the cartel, and the only way they broke free from this was to leave their neighborhoods and their culture behind. The negativities from these movies about Hispanics and Mexicans being bandits, criminals, or uneducated peasants, and the massive coverage of the drugs on war and the cartel that happened to be at the border, it was easy to see why these two would tend to kind of blend together again, and the American people would become so scared and hate such a culture that they just did not understand. When the capture of some of those cartel leaders and high lieutenants in those ranks were arrested, they sported the honorable Mexican mustache, and once that hit the news, the association of the Mexican mustache no longer represented change or loyalty or political parties, but it represented evil and power. At one point, it was believed that Mexicans would rather go bald than to ever shave their mustaches because of the representation it had. However, because of the way the media and the American film from Hollywood was representing the Mexican mustache, it was easy to understand why a culture would quickly shave their mustaches to disassociate with the negativity press that was being released. The Mexican mustache is nearly extinct, and this majestic creature is almost like a fairy tale. And the only representation of this Mexican mustache that we still have today is either associated with some type of cartel leader or high general or lieutenant, or it's sold in Halloween stores as an accessory to a sombrero to represent Mexico in a bag for $49.99. It's time to bring back the Mexican mustache and remember the political fighters and heroes that wore the Mexican mustache, such as Emiliano Zapata, who represented the people and fought for land reform. You can learn more about Emiliano Zapata in this next video. And I want to say I thank you guys so much for all the support, the new subscribers. I can't wait to see you guys next week for another episode of Beard History.